everybody.
Turn this up in my headphones, Charles.
Turning it up. Yeah. All right. Hello, everybody, one and all. Welcome to another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan. And as you could tell from the title of today's episode, we're back with another recommendation series.
Y'all just could not get enough of the recommendation series from what we can gather.
Yeah, you know, we test a lot of different series ideas on this show. We love our series on the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast, and this is one that's always pretty solid. So we're happy to bring another variation to our recommendation series.
Right? And what will that variation be today, Charles?
Well, Dylan, that variation is going to be funny fantasy series, and not like, fantasy books with humor is how we're phrasing it for the show. In the notes, we originally wrote funny fantasy, and we're like, it's not a great way to describe it. So fantasy books with humor is our recommendation. If you're like, I'm looking to chuckle a little bit, guffaw every once in a while in my fantasy.
Few guffaws in there.
Few guffaws. What would you recommend? And, well, you came to the right place. You're talking to the right people. We enjoy when a fantasy series has elements of humor in it. That's always a huge plus for me anyway. Even in these like modern fantasy, they can be kind of violent, but sometimes, the characters can be kind of funny. The dialogue can be funny. The introspective moments are often humorous. And those are the things we're trying to highlight in today's episode.
For sure, Charles. We can always go for a chortle or two.
Chortle indeed. And processing that, we're better to...
While Charles Googles the word chortle to get the definition,
I know what that means.
I'll say that you can't talk about humorous fantasy without talking about Terry Pratchett, right, Charles?
Absolutely.
If you were to, let's say, go on the Reddit's fantasy subreddit and just ask, hey, I want some funny fantasy, then I think you'd be pretty likely to see the most upvoted comment be Terry Pratchett and in some manner or another. And I think, Charles and I aren't experts by any stretch of imagination, really on anything, but but especially not on Terry Pratchett. And I think we've each read one novel, a different novel. I've read Mort,
and I've read The Color of Magic.
Right. And so we've gotten a taste of Terry Pratchett's humor, and we can definitely say, if you're looking for humorous fantasy, you're going to want to check out Terry Pratchett and see what you think.
Yeah, Terry Pratchett, he falls kind of a bit into satire. He falls in a bit of this, he almost kind of whimsy funny every once in a while, almost kind of cheeky funny every once in a while. His ideas can be rather clever, and the way he goes about satirizing different tropes or cliches in the fantasy genre, it is pretty humorous, and some of the situations he thinks up are quite zany as well, and that's why I think he's captured such a devout fan base to this day online.
Definitely, Charles. And the Discworld series, I guess is probably the best way to describe it, has a ton of books. I mean,
oh yeah,
Pratchett,
like 40 plus books.
Yeah. Pratchett cranked these books out. I think 41 novels, if I'm correct. So where we usually see people recommending to start is with Mort, which is the one I've read. Is an interesting little tale that has I guess it'd be an anthropomorphized death. Is that accurate? Did I use that right? I know I was on myself for using
A
it personified.
characterization of
God, I always use that wrong.
anthropomorphized is like making an animal look like a human being.
Attributing human characteristics or behavior to a god, an animal, or object. I think that's fair.
Okay, sure,
I think I
sure.
dropped that all right.
I just think of like Disney characters when I think of anthropomorphizing things. But
yeah, well, I'm gonna say to attribute human form or personality to things not human. I'm gonna say we did it, and I'll say that there's an anthropomorphized death, which is basically like a Grim Reaper-ish type character, but a lot more funny than what you might typically get in a Grim Reaper type. And he's kind of reflective, I guess. He tends to muse about his role as Death, and I think that would be the place I'd say to start based on what I've seen online.
yeah, a lot of people like I have not read Mort, but a lot of like when you like where to start reading Terry Pratchett, people are like, well, the first book is Color of Magic. That's not a bad place to start, and that's where I started. I tend to like to start with like publication order, but everyone's like, well, Mort is one of his better works and is a very strong start as well. So I think with either one, you're in good hands. I just remember from my read of Color of Magic, there's this whole thing about like one guy explaining to another guy the idea of insurance, and it was just a really kooky conversation. So, I mean, it's the stuff that Pratchett's writing is unlike anything else I've read in fantasy. And if you really like that satirical, dry, slightly whimsical kind of humor, there's no better example.
Well said, Charles. And it's probably good for us to mention that the Discworld series doesn't move in a straight line in terms of like book 1 happens and book 2 is a sequel of book 1, and then book 3 happens right after that.
When you have 41 books, I guess.
It hops around, and the story that you would get if you were to pick up, let's say, Mort or many of the other series or many of the other novels in this series would be its own unique story. So you don't have to start with publication order, although certainly a good way to go if that's what you're into.
Yeah. And the Pratchett fans have different recommendations for where to start. There's many conversations on many different threads of the internet have talked about like reading orders for Terry Pratchett. I don't think you can go wrong anywhere, but definitely check those out. There's a lot of really dedicated fans out there to Terry Pratchett. He's got a pretty committed fan base, one of the more committed I've seen online anyway, of fantasy authors. So well deserved as well. And segueing a little bit away from Terry Pratchett, but not too far, is a series that neither one of us have read, but we've both seen the TV show, right? You've seen the TV show of Good Omens.
I have indeed, Charles.
Yeah, I enjoyed the series. It reminded me of another series that we'll bring up later in the episode, so stick around for that. But
nice tease.
It balances Terry Pratchett with another famous fantasy author that we haven't really talked about on the show, and that's Neil Gaiman.
Yeah, we have not talked much about Neil Gaiman. I know you've read American Gods.
Yeah, I've read American Gods. I've read a lot of the Sandman stuff. I've read Coraline. I'm a big Neil Gaiman fan. He's almost like, I don't know, this is maybe overgeneralizing a little bit, but he's kind of like the, oh gosh, who's the guy that does like Edward Scissorhands and Nightmare Before Christmas and all those movies?
Oh God.
But he's like that guy. I'm gonna make a lot of people. There's a lot of people screaming. Tim Burton.
Thank you.
There's all those people screaming at home. I'm sorry. And this is not one for one, but he's kind of like the Tim Burton of fantasy, where it's like when his name's out there, there's a unique style and vision that's almost kind of this little bit of gothic macabre little influence to him, but it's also very uniquely Neil Gaiman, and that's what I mean when I say he's like the Tim Burton of fantasy books. So when you see that Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett coming together to make a fantasy book, you're like, wow, I wonder what we're getting into here, because Terry Pratchett is often more kinds of like silly, whimsical satire, and Neil Gaiman can often write very like intense, cerebral kind of stuff. So to see how they come together is really interesting. And I can't speak for the book because I haven't read it, but I do know that it's very popular and very well received. And I can tell from the show that there is, they both influence each other to a very successful degree. It was fun to watch that balance of, you have angels and demons who are pairing up together, an unlikely duo who kind of just want to enjoy living in Earth for a while and don't want to get caught up in the godly politics between angels and demons. And it's funny to watch that play out. There's these elements of like, there's this greater, heaven versus hell situation, and then there's these two guys who are just trying to, be chill. So it's interesting to see how that plays out. And it's a really fun adventure story in a lot of ways. The main characters have this kind of endearing relationship, and there's a lot of funny narration moments where you're like, how did they even think to phrase things that way? It's really quite silly, and it gets a little kooky at times, but it's all within this realm of that satirical, whimsical fantasy. It was just a fun little adventure.
Right. I had fun watching that as well, Charles. The word that comes to mind for me when I think of Good Omens is irreverent.
Yes.
Yeah, it totally knows what its tone is, and doubles and then triples and then quadruples down on this is what we are. And you got to appreciate something that's just unabashedly irreverent like Good Omens is.
Yeah, they do a great job. And kudos to David Tennant and Michael Sheen for like knocking it out of the park with those roles. There's so much charm and charisma to their performances. It's like so well lived in for how I imagine a Terry Pratchett character to be, that like overwhelming charisma and charm and wit, while also being endearing. It's a lot of fun. So I would definitely recommend the show to any fantasy fans out there. And one of these days I'll pick up that book. It's on the list.
Our TBR is intimidatingly long at this point.
Yes,
Charles.
I know. Every time we do a recommendation series, I'm like, man, that's another thing I got to add to the pile.
Yep. It's tough. I don't know if we'll ever quite get through the entirety of our TBR, but we'll do our best. Never say never.
That's right.
I'll never say never, Charles. Yeah, I want to make sure to highlight a series that I really enjoy by author Nicholas Eames when it comes to fantasy that has a good sense of humor, and that's Kings of the Wild is the one that I've read. The whole thing is called the Band series, and that's Kings of the Wild and Bloody Rose. And I haven't read Bloody Rose yet because of all those trying to manage my TBR issues that we were talking about before, but I really want to. Speaking to Kings of the Wild, it's the story of a group of formerly great adventurers, sort of like a D&D group. Doesn't have any of those elements of actually playing D&D, but just the kind of troop that you'd expect from group of adventurers like a D&D group might look like. And they're well past their primes at this point. They've kind of moved on past their adventures. And then one of the members' daughters gets in a pretty tough situation where they feel like they've got to go save her. And they end up in a situation where they're trying to get the band back together to save this member's daughter. And the phrasing there is very intentional with getting the band back together, because a lot of the humor of this book comes from not just the fact that they're kind of like past their prime at this point and not your typical adventurers, but also that the whole thing is basically paralleling the like 70s band scene, like the 70s music scene. And there's just tons of it's kind of an interesting balance of it's like it's subtext. You could if you're completely unfamiliar with the 70s music scene, and I'm not overly familiar, I think Charles would probably be more familiar than me,
Yeah, I
but
love the '70s music scene.
I think you'd love this series, Charles. It's
You
almost like
pitched
someone
it, and
tried
I
to pitch
almost
it at one
picked it.
point. I so anyway, a you could be completely oblivious to all of that and just enjoy this fantasy story for exactly a fantasy story and nothing beyond that. But the way that it weaves in all of these references to the music scene in the 1970s and just music in general is just an absolute riot. And I had a great time reading it for both purposes of just a fantasy novel and for all these references.
Right. I first heard of this series when you pitched it on Friends Pitching Fantasy, and I almost chose it because it sounded so in my lane. You know, I love 70s rock and roll. I was a classic rock nerd in high school, so it very much piqued my interest. And then I have to say, if the series is anything like the author, also, it's been funny watching him like tweet and comment on stuff. He tweeted at us his Kings of the Wild playlist, and I got to listen
Right.
to that. And that's such a testament to his story. It's like he has like Mozart and Bach, and then he has Led Zeppelin and Rolling Stones all in the same playlist. So
And
I'm like,
Final
if that's
Fantasy soundtrack, which is near and dear to my heart. I think I was like, I said something like Rolling Stones and Final Fantasy soundtrack together at last, and I meant that.
I know. So if his taste in music is anything like his taste in his writing style, you know, his writing preferences, then I, I would love to read this series. It sounds really exciting. And sometimes, you know, you lead a lot of these more intense fantasy series. A lot of the modern stuff is very dark, and it's just so appealing to crack into one of these more like fantasy books with humor or with style or just that are designed to be more fun for fun's sake, you know, and that's the most appealing thing about it when I hear people talk about the series. It just sounds fun.
Oh, it's so much fun, Charles. And it's very lovingly written. I think at points I'd called it satire of the music scene, but I feel like satire kind of implies that there's some
Yeah.
like desire to point out what's wrong with it or make a lot of fun of it. And I think that what I get from Nicholas Eames is just he's a big fan of these things, and you can see him enjoying writing it and reveling in the inspiration that he drew from the 1970s music scene for Kings of the Wild, and from what I hear, the 1980s music scene for Bloody Rose. So I I had an awesome time reading it, and I can't say enough about how much I recommend this. And we have had these awesome interactions with Nicholas Eames, the author, on Twitter. He seems super nice. So, yeah, all
Yeah,
good things.
yeah, great recommendation and one you've made a couple times. So I'm excited to read that one as well. Throw it on the pile. Just need to have
Yeah,
like an
yep.
image of just a pile of books, and then me just throwing another one on top of it. You know, like a mound of books. That's what it feels like sometimes. But yeah, definitely looking forward to reading that one. These next two, Dylan, are series that we've talked about a lot, and I think you do the most justice in talking about them. So why don't you kick us off with the one of them? Let's go through it.
Sure
The one, give them
thing.
the old
Well,
1-2.
give him the 1-2, and that's Lies of Loch Lamora is the one, and I guess First Law is the two.
Yeah.
We've talked so much about these that I want to give space in this podcast for us to talk, or in this episode for us to talk more about other stuff, because our longtime fans know everything. uh, but or know a lot. We still haven't
Right.
read either of them. But I'll say Lies of Loch Lamora that's by Scott Lynch. It's the first of the Gentleman Bastard sequence. I recommend all of it. It's got a pretty dark tone to it and an anti-hero protagonist. Shout out to our anti-hero episode.
Shout out.
Yeah. And I think that it's not that the narration of it or like the story itself is that funny, but the characters and their dialogue is so witty and hilarious. I mean, I remember at times thinking like, how the thing, I'm not complaining here, but it's almost unrealistic how every character is so witty and funny
Yeah.
in the Lies of Locke Lamora and the rest of the Gentleman Bastard sequence. So that's what I gotta say on that. If you love witty dialogue, you're gonna love the Lies of Locke Lamora series, the Gentleman Bastard sequence. Next, First Law. Uh, I'm I have to think one of Joe Abercrombie's biggest fans out there.
And
Uh,
we're going to be talking about the First Law
right.
trilogy a lot more in just a short amount of weeks, as it's next on our buddy read lineup. So we'll have plenty of time there. And not to mention, it's come up so many times in our character series, well deserved. It comes up a lot in our recommendation series, and that's because it fits so many niches in fantasy. You know, it's like the whole First Law series is very much like so much great characterization, so much great subversion, so much great, tropes even. But I would say one of the things that shines for me the most in the First Law trilogy is how fun it is to listen or read these characters' inner monologues, introspectives, the descriptions of things come from this air of humor that is so in line with my own personal sense of humor that I felt like he was writing this book for me a lot of times. I'm like, the way he phrases things and says things and points out funny things and the thoughts that characters have and how they react to things, it's so unique and so funny and so like engaging, and it adds to the characterization of these characters, and it's just like, oh, it's what makes the series so good. And there's so many funny moments. Like there's moments that I remember, it's been years since I've read the series, and I remember so many things. I remember once where it was like someone was embarrassed or shocked or something, and it was like his face turned red like a slapped arse, and I was like, that's pretty funny. I was like, it's still in my brain, it will live there forever. It's just moments like that throughout.
For sure, Charles. I think what you're touching on there is, uh, while this series is called grimdark a lot of times, and people talk about how it's so gritty and all these kind of things. Joe Abercrombie's voice has such a strong, dry humor to it, and that comes
Yes.
through no matter what is going on in terms of the story. The narration is just full of these like clever witticisms
Yes.
that make it so that no matter how dark it gets, I think this is part of what gets me through it more than anything. Is like no matter how dark it gets, Abercrombie brings it back up by having that sense of humor that makes all of this bearable. And I think that it's such a huge part of what makes Abercrombie such an amazing writer, and something that I think he doesn't. Even though, of course, I think most people, if you say like Abercrombie's funny, right? They'd be like, if they've read it, they'd be like, oh yeah, like guy's got a good sense of humor. It's not something that people bring up as often as I think he deserves to be praised for. So, and those idiosyncrasies of the characters, like you mentioned, Charles, like Logan is such an unforgettable character. It's such a funny internal monologue. So,
Yeah,
yep.
yeah. And sometimes when it's like he's this brutal, violent guy, but then sometimes he gets these like fish out of water moments that are so funny. It's just like, I don't know. For me, some of the best dry humor in all of fantasy is found in First Law. So if you're looking for a fantasy book with humor, check out those books because they're excellent. Joe Abercrombie's voice is perfect with that kind of stuff.
Yeah, no one else like him. And another author that has a pretty unique voice is Martha Wells, which comes through in her Murderbot diaries. There's the first novella, which is All Systems Red, and it's got this character named Murderbot who is basically a killing machine, pretty much literally, right? I guess that's
Yeah.
what a murder bot is.
Yeah.
And, and despite being programmed to be a killing machine, it's hacked its government module and basically just wants to chill out and watch like soap operas and other TV shows and stuff like that. And it's a really interesting space opera, but the whole thing is really centered around this character and the way that Martha Wells captures the voice of Murderbot. I think it's something I think I've pitched on Friends Pitching
You have.
Fantasy before, Charles, and there's there's some great quotes from it. One that gets quoted all the time is, "I could have become a mass murderer after I hacked my governor module, but then I realized I could access the combined feed of entertainment channels carried on the company satellites. It had been well over 35,000 hours or so since then, with still not much murdering, but probably, I don't know, a little under 35,000 hours of movies, serials, books, plays, and music consumed. As a heartless killing machine, I was a terrible failure." And I think
I
that
can
sums up.
relate to that.
Yeah, Charles, you're not a great heartless killing machine.
And I love television.
Oh, yeah, sure. That too.
So yeah, I mean, Murderbot. What was appealing about it to me when you pitched it, I haven't read it, but the things that stuck out to me were like, it's funny, it's charming, it's different, and it's like a lighthearted, shorter read too. Which all those things were very appealing to me at the time. So, if that kind of book sounds appealing to you, I'm like, pick it up now. Why not?
Yeah. Well, you,
Oh,
Charles.
all right. Well, it's on the because instead I have to read like 8 Joe Abercrombie books and 14 Wheel of Time books.
I think we can find a way to sneak a novella in there, but
Yes,
there's a
I think
tease
we
for
can.
you. I'm good because I'm gonna badger Charles behind the scenes until he says yes. So, yep.
We'll get there. We'll read it. I'm telling you, it's another. Just picture another book being thrown into a mound of books, and that's Murderbots. One that I don't have to add to my TBR list, one that I've read
Nailed it.
already. Yes, this is another kind of a deeper cut here. This is called Bridge of Birds. It's from a series called Master Lee and the Number 10 Ox by Barry Hugart. It first came across my path in my travels just because someone
Your travels.
someone had recommended it to me as like a it's just like a really it was pitched as funny, first of all, and endearing, and also it was just supposed to be like this really fun. It's a trilogy, but the first book, Bridge of Birds, can also be perceived as a standalone as well. So I think, that was kind of what drew me towards it. And then also the setting, it's in like it's inspired by like Chinese mythology. So it takes place in also almost like a mythical ancient China. And that kind of drew me to it as well. And it is full of humor. Like I would say if you like humor that's kind of unique to like, I feel like anime has like its own kind of endearing humor sometimes. And like in ways that like Avatar can be funny sometimes or Dragon Ball can be funny sometimes. The same thing happens with Bridge of Birds. Like sometimes these characters are just like humorous, and the situations they're in, the observations they have are so kooky and funny. And the narration, it's told in such a serious, like mythical storytelling way sometimes, but it'll go off about funny moments in the story that's happening. Like there's a character that can shapeshift into anything and the main character's like on its back trying to keep it down, and the whole narration's like he was just praying he didn't change into a porcupine, a scorpion, but thankfully he didn't do any of those things, so it's like those kinds of funny moments. And then like the stuff that happens is pretty kooky as well. So I would say any anime fans, anyone looking for like a fun, more like mythical, fable-y kind of storytelling, kind of prose, should take a little voyage off the beaten path and check out Bridge of Birds by Barry Hugart. It's a charming read. It's a pretty quick read, and the characters of Master Lee and Number 10 Ox are so brilliant. Master Lee, he's kind of like a fallen from grace but still smart guy. He's kind of like a Master Roshi, where he's super talented but he's also kind of a recluse, and he also has some like not great qualities to his character, but he's overall still pretty charming and wise. And then Number 10 Ox, he's just kind of like an innocent gentle giant type. And so you can picture like this young, gentle giant carrying this like cranky old master on his back, and they go off on adventures, and it's just fun. It's more of that like light spirited fantasy, and well worth a read for anyone interested in like a more epic but humorous fantasy tale.
Nailed it, Charles.
Thank
I
you.
think it almost sounds like when you describe the characters, it's like a Lenny and George situation.
It's
like
pretty
Mice and Men.
similar. Yeah, it's pretty similar, except number 10 Ox is more just like I don't know, he's just more kind of stoic and down for whatever. and Master Lee is kind of like he's very clever, he's very smart, and but he can be a little bit mischievous too, so a little bit cheeky sometimes, and it's fun to watch the two of them together. They make a good pair. So that relationship is kind of close. You see a lot of those relationships sometimes. It's like the big oafy person and the small scrap, like the planner guy. Right? There's a lot of those in storytelling, and this is just another fun example of that.
Nice. Well, you might hear me now in the background placing Bridge of Birds onto the TBR because I do have to check that out, and I'm excited.
It's deserving of a read. It comes up on like top 10 lists every once in a while, but I don't really know of anyone else that's read it, so it's becoming more of a cult book more and more these days. But
yeah,
it's worth the read.
I know you mentioned it in our. We haven't released this
Yeah,
episode.
you don't spoil it,
bank.
but we have talked about it just on an episode we never released.
Yeah.
Or have yet to release, I guess we could say.
Yeah, but we'll open up those vaults one day and
That's
let
right.
those episodes breathe. Well, Charles, I know there's another series we wanted to talk about that's near and dear to your heart, so I'll let you lead the recommendation for this
Thank you. That's quite the honor for this book. So, before I ever was a fantasy fan, I was a science fiction fan, and I have I know, can you believe it?
Shocking.
And now I just love both. And
telling on yourself, Charles.
Yeah. And now I have these very fond memories of being in like middle school and high school, and you had like library class and you had like independent reading or whatever. And this book is one that I just had so much fun reading during that time frame. It's also one that I was alluding to when we were talking about Terry Pratchett, of like, Terry Pratchett and this series I'm going to talk about have a lot in common, and this is none other than The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Classic sci-fi romp, and it is just absolutely teeming with these insanely hilarious ideas, thoughts, postulates, like all kinds of kooky things are going on. It's a satire of science fiction, but it's also like a love letter to science fiction, much like Terry Pratchett and his work in the fantasy world. And just the wisdom that he imparts. It is kind of wisdom in a way. It's nonsensical, but it's also like kind of satirical and witty at the same time. And there's so many like beautiful moments that I can think of, like, there's a very common one of like, where all like the Earth is doomed and all the dolphins are like flying into space. It's like, what do dolphins say to humanity as they're leaving Earth? They say, "So long and thanks for all the fish." It's like, of course, that's like something about that's just absolutely hilarious. And then like I was just going through some old quotes that I have from the book. It's like, the ships hung in the sky in as much the same way that bricks don't. It's like what? Who even writes that? Funny, he intoned funerarily, how just when you think life can't possibly get any worse, it suddenly does. And it's just a common mistake that people make when trying to design something completely foolproof is to underestimate the ingenuity of complete fools. It's like this book is absolutely full to the brim, teeming with these funny, silly, ingenious lines. And I just remember being like my, teenager brain reading this for the first time, like, this man is brilliant. Of course, he's so crazy. And it's like these different way of thinking and of writing stories and expressing ideas. It's so much fun to read, and I couldn't recommend it enough.
And that's what we're here doing, is recommending. But Charles, are you feeling we have actually recommended it recommended enough over here?
I mean, have you read Hitchhikers?
I I'm gonna admit to a cardinal sin here, Charles.
Oh boy.
I've never read Hitchhikers.
Wow, I think you'd find it funny. It
It
borders
sounds
on
like I
this.
would.
It borders on this silliness that I don't know how. Like, it's not like the dry wittiness of like a Joe Abercrombie or Eliza Lamora, but it is clever enough in its silliness that I think you'd be on board with it.
I was enjoying those quotes you're reading. I'm of course familiar with some of them just by being, I guess, sci-fi adjacent and reading a lot of fantasy. The so long and thanks for all the fish. I've always appreciated everything I've heard from it. All those quotes you read definitely make me want to read it. It sounds
Oh
like
my gosh. Yeah,
fans of
the
Terry Pratchett and all that would find themselves at home if they haven't read Hitchhiker's
yeah, the
Guide.
mind of Douglas Adams has to be wild, man. He's he comes up with some amazing thing, and there's like the difference between like the answer to the universe, the life, the universe, and everything, and then the question. It's so funny. Like it's super funny. And there's a lot of popular lines like on fantasy threads. People are like, "What's the funniest line in a book you've ever read?" And like, there's some really common Hitchhikers ones that come up all the time from later books, I think, where it's like God created the universe and everyone regarded it as a bad move or something like that. Like, that one always comes up.
Oh
And
yeah, I've read that one.
it's so
It's like,
funny. But
yeah.
I mean, his books are full of that. I have like this one like compendium that has like all of the Hitchhiker's Guide books in it, and it's like a massive paperback. It's like 6 inches tall, and it sits proudly on my bookshelf. They're kooky and wild, but they're very unique.
I found the quote. In the beginning, the universe was created. This has made a lot of people very angry and been widely regarded as a bad move.
I love that. Like,
Yeah.
it's brilliant. So it's
Yeah.
brilliant and also nonsensical. Like, that humor I've always loved. Like, when you have to put thought into sounding stupid, it becomes brilliant in my mind. And like, this Douglas Adams Hitchhiker's Guide world is full of that stuff. And it's, he worked so hard to making this silly, stupid world, and it's all the better for it.
I think, yeah, I mean, it does make sense, though. It's like, if
Yeah, it's
the
not
universe was
actually
never created,
stupid. Yeah.
if the universe was never created, then there wouldn't be people to get very angry.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's like, it's got this kind of sense of, I think people often like to complain about the state of the world and how bad things are. So it's like, it kind of pokes fun at that. Like, well, the alternative is no universe. But
I know. It's so brilliant. Love it.
yeah,
I get some of
it's
that in King Killer sometimes, where he goes out of his way
yeah.
to be like self-deprecating or kind of silly, but he puts a lot of thought and structure behind it when he expresses it. It's not as satirical and whimsical as Hitchhikers, but it does approach that humorous silliness every once in a while. Patrick Rothfuss is not afraid to like get loose with his structure and bend things, but it's very thought out and built up when he does it. And that's kind of the parallel I'm trying to draw here.
Right. I definitely see that. I think Rothfuss's books are definitely very funny, and I think it could have made it into this list, but it's not one of the first things that comes to mind for me when I think
Yeah,
of
it has
those books,
funny
which is
moments, but in
kinda,
a book
yeah.
that big, it doesn't have enough funny moments for it to be considered like a
And it
funny book.
Yeah, and it never feels like the point. Like,
Yeah.
or like, not that it's the point.
It's
in
not
all
really
these things, but it never
Rothfuss's
feels like it's
voice
like,
too much.
yeah.
Like, whereas Joe Abercrombie, like, his witticism is a huge part of his voice.
Exactly.
Whereas Rothfuss, he will go there and he does it successfully, but it's not his main thing. He's really more interested in
Exactly.
like telling a beautiful phrase or something like that that may not always be silly or witty or funny. It's just always meaningful, but not always humorous.
Totally agree. And I mean, there's plenty of novels out there that have lots of funny moments when they're trying to. I mean,
Sure,
I
all
can
the
think
best
of
ones do.
yeah,
I mean, I
and
remember
it's
laughing at Harry Potter a lot too, but I wouldn't call that like a funny book either. So like any book with good characters is going to have moments that make us laugh.
yeah. I mean, think of all these great moments we get out of someone like Tyrion. Well, it's like, yeah, Tyrion's
Yeah.
hilarious, but we didn't think that A Song of Ice and Fire really made sense on
And
the
picture
list
picture
for
Gandalf going,
humorous fantasy
"Fool of a took,
recommendations.
throw yourself in next time and rid us of your stupidity." It's like, okay, that's funny, but it's not all about that.
No. But these books here, I think, would all be great choices for people out there looking for funny books. I hope we've done a good job of pointing out what makes each of them funny so that you can look through this list and decide on one that's appropriate for the kind of humor that you're looking for, because there's a lot on offer.
Very
Once we've
well
listed
said, Dylan. And you know what? If we get just one chortle out of this from one of our listeners, it will be all worth it. Am I right?
We got chortle out of me there, Charles. I don't know if that makes it worth it.
It always does, Dylan. It always does.
Oh, Charles, it's such a delight talking fantasy with my friend.
Dude, you took the words right out of my mouth, dude. This was such a delight, so much fun. It's nice to talk about the humorous side of fantasy, and thank you all for listening. If you liked what you heard today, if you like some of these recommendations, if you want to give them a try, if there's other series that you'd recommend that are fantasy books with humor, let us know on Twitter at the FTF Podcast with a number 1 at the end. You can also reach out to us on Facebook and Instagram at the FTF Podcast. You can shoot us an email at theftfpodcast@gmail.com. If you want to support the show and you just happen to be listening on Apple Podcasts, toss 5 stars to our podcast, guys. There's so much opportunity to do good for us there. It's so easy. You just go to our account and you hit 5 stars, leave your honest review. Let us know you love the show.
Leave your honest review, but also give us 5 stars.
Yeah, I
says
mean,
Charles.
if you honestly don't think it should be 5 stars, send us an email and let us know, and let us earn that 5 stars. Like, don't
That's
ruin
not
our
what we
lives
do.
by giving us a 1-star review.
It's all Charles has. Is this podcast.
Yeah, this is it for me, man. And with that being said, I hope you got a good chortle out of this. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.